Hello, so today I'll be talking about folic acid and prenatal vitamins and its impact on gestational diabetes. So what is gestational diabetes? It is diabetes that develop during pregnancy, and it occurs when blood glucose levels are significantly high. And during pregnancy, the placenta produces hormones. So women who have gestational diabetes usually have normal or elevated levels of blood insulin, but their hormones that are produced by the placenta counteract that insulin, so the blood sugar becomes elevated. So the hormones that the placenta produces raises maternal blood glucose levels so that the fetus can get nutrients it needs from extra glucose in the blood. So during pregnancy, the pancreas has to work harder and puts out more insulin than it is produced prior in pregnancy. So if the pancreas in pregnancy cannot keep up with the glucose lowering insulin, then the blood glucose levels can rise, and that's how women develop gestational diabetes. And they are insulin resistant, and it is similar to type 2 diabetes. So some complications with gestational diabetes, complications that may affect the baby could be excessive birth weight, which I'm going to talk about a little more later, earlier preterm birth, along with respiratory distress syndrome. So as a mother's high blood glucose sugar increases, her risk of early labor before the due date is often increased. And the doctor may recommend early delivery due to a larger baby, which I'll also talk about later. And then some more complications that may affect the baby could be hypoglycemia, which I'll go into later, and type 2 diabetes later in life. Some complications that may affect the mother could be high blood pressure and preeclampsia. So gestational diabetes raises your risk of high blood pressure, as well as preeclampsia, which is a complication of pregnancy that causes high blood pressure and other symptoms that can threaten the lives of both the mother and the baby. And another complication is also future diabetes. So common prevention is usually healthy diet, exercise, weight loss before pregnancy, and taking prenatal vitamins. And this picture just kind of describes a complication that may affect the baby, which is excessive birth weight. So on the left, you see a normal baby, and then on the right, you see a baby whose mother had gestational diabetes, and you can kind of see the white that lines the outside, which that is actually fat. So you can see they have more excessive fat. So this is just a little statistic. 204 million women are diagnosed with gestational diabetes in 2018. This is according to the International Diabetes Federation. So hormonal regulation in gestational diabetes. The placenta is a temporary organ formed in the uterus of the pregnant woman, and it secretes hormones such as estrogen, progesterone, cortisol, and the human placental lactogen, which is also known as HPL. And these hormones that are secreted by the placenta can affect how the body uses insulin. So in a normal pregnancy, when the glucose levels rise, insulin levels increase and is released from the beta cells in the pancreas to take up glucose from the blood. And in gestational diabetes, the hormones that are produced from the placenta, like we said, increase maternal glucose levels. And when glucose levels rise and insulin is then blocked by the hormones produced by the placenta, and this can lead to a buildup of glucose in the blood instead of it being absorbed by the cells. And this extra glucose can trigger the baby's pancreas to make more insulin. and this can cause a baby to grow too large, and this syndrome is called macrosomia. So this picture is kind of just explaining what I just said, and like we said, gestational diabetes is similar to type 2 diabetes. So on the top picture, you have a healthy individual, and this is just saying that the hormone insulin is taken up by its receptor on the outside of the cell, and it kind of starts this cascade that allows glucose to enter the cell and removing it from the bloodstream. However, in type 2 diabetes or gestational diabetes, there's an impairment in that receptor on the outside of the cell, so they do not recognize insulin, or in the case of gestational diabetes, those hormones produced by the placenta blocks that insulin, so the cascade does not occur and glucose does not enter the bloodstream. So hormonal regulation in the baby due to gestational diabetes. So high maternal blood sugar travels through the placenta and causes the baby to have high glucose levels. So as we said, the baby's pancreas makes extra insulin in order for it to lower that blood glucose. And the fetus can transform that extra sugar into fat, and this leads to that syndrome called macrosomia, which is just larger weight or more excessive fat than average. And hypoglycemia is often a complication in babies whose mother have gestational diabetes, and this is because once the baby is born, they no longer have that high blood sugar levels from the mother, that this causes the baby's blood sugar to fall very low, and it can end up causing brain fuel deprivation. And this picture is just explaining that. So you have high blood glucose levels from the mother, which brings extra glucose to the baby and can cause the baby to put on extra weight. So folic acid, which is also called vitamin B9, is very important in the first weeks of pregnancy when the brain and spinal cord are forming. So folic acid is recommended to help prevent birth defects known as neural tube defects, or and an example of this would be spinal bifida. So there's a thing called folic acid fortification, and this is the levels of folic acid consumption that can help prevent birth defects, and these levels have increased over the years. And a new study actually shows that folic acid consumption in pregnancy may increase the risk of gestational diabetes, and it can affect glucose metabolism and lead to insulin resistance. So this graph is just explaining that study that was done, and it is the U.S. incidence of diabetes over the past 50 years, and as you can see, the red arrow depicts the mandatory fortification of folic acid, and then the green bar is just the measurements of the folate levels in subjects over the years, and you can see that you have the percent of diabetes actually increasing with the increasing folic acid fortification levels. So the metabolic pathway that's involved is glycolysis, and there's two stages. Stage 1 is the ATP investment, which is steps 1 through 5, and this requires energy or ATP. And stage 2 is ATP production, and this is steps 6 through 10, and this is the production or gain of energy or ATP. Okay, so I'm just going to explain glycolysis fairly quickly. So in step 1, we have glucose, which is phosphorylated into glucose 6-phosphate by hexokinase, and this step actually requires an input of ATP to be used. In step 2, we have that glucose 6-phosphate, which is converted to fructose 6-phosphate, and this is done by the enzyme phosphoglucose isomerase, and this step does not use any ATP. In step 3, we have fructose 6-phosphate, which is converted to fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, and this is done by using the enzyme phosphofructose kinase, and this step does require the use of one ATP molecule. In step 4, we have fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, which is converted to glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, also known as GAP, and dihydroxyacetone phosphate, also known as DHAP, and this is done by the enzyme aldolase, and no ATP is used in this step. Then step 5, we have our DHAP, which is converted into GAP using the enzyme triose phosphate isomerase, and no ATP is used in this step. Then in step 6, we have our 2 molecules of GAP, which are converted into our 2 molecules of 1,3-biphosphoglycerates, and this is done by using the enzyme glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase. And once again, in this step, ATP is not used, but we do produce 2 molecules of NADH. In step 7, we have 2 molecules of 1,3-biphosphoglycerates, which are converted into 2 molecules of 3-phosphoglycerates. This is done by using phosphoglycerate kinase, and in this step we do produce 2 ATP molecules. In step 8, we have 2 molecules of 3-phosphoglycerates. These molecules are converted into 2 molecules of 2-phosphoglycerates. This is done by using the enzyme phosphoglycerate mutase, and we do not produce ATP in this step. Step 9, we have 2 molecules of 2-phosphoglycerates, which are converted to 2 molecules of phosphoenol pyruvates. This is done by using enolase, and no ATPs are produced. And in our final step, we have 2 phosphophenol pyruvates, which are converted into 2 pyruvates using the enzyme pyruvate kinase, and this step produces 2 ATP molecules. So in all, we produce a net gain of 2 ATP molecules, we produce 2 NADHs and 2 pyruvates, and that's glycolysis. So glycolysis breaks down glucose into pyruvate in order to produce ATP or energy, and glycolysis can be dysregulated in individuals who are insulin resistant, and this is like the pregnant women who take folic acid, which can cause gestational diabetes. And in babies born from mothers with gestational diabetes, hypoglycemia may be a concern. And hypoglycemia or low blood sugar can affect glycolysis, and it can decrease ATP production, which is important for normal brain function and survival. So in conclusion, though folic acid is an important supplement in pregnancy, the levels of consumption should be closely monitored. This is because folic acid can increase insulin resistance, which can further progress into gestational diabetes. And women with gestational diabetes should also pay attention to folic acid intake and prenatal vitamins because it can increase blood glucose levels even more. And that high maternal glucose levels coupled with insulin resistance can be harmful to the mother and the baby by dysregulating glycolysis.